The morning sun peeked through Marcus Thompson's bedroom window, casting warm rays across his superhero bedsheets. The 8-year-old boy had been awake since dawn, too excited to sleep. Today was special. It was the opening day of the summer fair, and for the first time, he had his own money to spend. Marcus sat cross-legged on his bed, carefully counting the 5 $1 bills he'd saved from doing extra chores around the house. He'd been saving for 3 weeks, giving up his usual Friday candy bar and helping Mrs. Parker next door water her plants. Each dollar represented a small victory, and he had big plans for them at the fair. "Marcus, breakfast is ready," his mother's voice called from downstairs. He quickly tucked the money into his Batman wallet and rushed down to the kitchen, nearly tripping over his untied shoelaces in excitement. The smell of pancakes filled the air, but Marcus could barely focus on eating. His mind was already at the fair, imagining the sounds of laughter and the sweet scent of cotton candy. "Slow down, honey," Mrs. Thompson said, watching her son practically inhale his breakfast. "The fair isn't going anywhere." She smiled, remembering how tight money had been last year when they couldn't afford to go. This year was different. She had picked up extra shifts at the diner, and Marcus had worked so hard to save his own spending money. Marcus helped clear the breakfast dishes, though his hands trembled with anticipation. While his mother got ready, he stood in front of the mirror in the hallway, trying to fix his curly black hair. He wanted to look nice for the pictures his mom always insisted on taking. The drive to the fairgrounds felt like forever, even though it was only 15 minutes away. Marcus pressed his face against the car window, counting the telephone poles they passed to make time go faster. His mother hummed along to the radio, occasionally glancing at her son's excited reflection in the rearview mirror. When they finally pulled into the parking lot, Marcus's eyes grew wide. The fairground had transformed from an empty field into a magical place overnight. Colorful flags fluttered in the summer breeze, and he could see the Ferris wheel rising high above everything else, its metal frame gleaming in the morning light. The line to get in wasn't too long yet. They had arrived early, just as they planned. Marcus held his mother's hand as they waited, bouncing slightly on his toes. He watched other families arrive, some with children younger than him, others with teenagers who tried to look cool, but couldn't hide their excitement. "Remember what we talked about," Mrs. Thompson said as they neared the entrance. "Stay where I can see you, and we'll decide together how to spend your money wisely." Marcus nodded seriously. He had already planned it all out: $1 for games, $2 for rides, and $2 for the perfect ice cream cone he'd been dreaming about. Not just any ice cream, he wanted the special swirled chocolate and vanilla from Mr. Johnson's ice cream stand, the one everyone said was the best in town. As they handed their tickets to the smiling attendant at the gate, Marcus felt his heart beating faster. The sounds and smells hit him all at once. Popcorn popping, children laughing, music playing from different directions, and the sweet scent of cotton candy floating through the air. Marcus squeezed his mother's hand tighter as they walked through the entrance. Everything seemed bigger and more colorful than he had imagined. The carousel horses pranced in endless circles to their left, while the ring-toss booth to their right displayed rows of stuffed animals waiting to be won. "Where should we start?" his mother asked, though she already knew the answer. Marcus had talked about nothing else for days. "Can we walk around first?" Marcus replied, wanting to see everything before making any decisions. "I want to make sure I spend my money on the perfect things." His mother nodded, proud of her son's thoughtfulness. Together, they began their journey through the fair, unaware that this ordinary summer day would soon become extraordinary in ways neither of them could imagine. 2. 7-year-old Darnell Williams sat at his small kitchen table, pushing dry cereal around in his bowl. The morning sun streamed through the apartment window, and with it came the distant sound of carnival music. The summer fair had begun, and from his family's third-floor apartment, you could just barely see the top of the Ferris wheel spinning in the distance. "Finish your breakfast, baby," his mother, Lisa Williams, called from the bathroom where she was getting ready for work. She worked as a nurse's aide at the local hospital, and today she had picked up an extra shift. Times had been tough since Darnell's father left 6 months ago, and extra shifts meant extra money they desperately needed. Darnell spooned the last bits of cereal into his mouth, trying not to think about the fair. Last year, before his dad left, they had all gone together. He remembered the taste of cotton candy melting on his tongue, and the way his father had lifted him onto his shoulders to see over the crowd. But this year was different. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door will check on you during her lunch break, his mother said, emerging from the bathroom in her light blue scrubs. She looked tired, but her smile was warm as she kissed the top of his head. I'm sorry about the fair, sweetheart. Maybe next weekend we can go to the park instead. Darnell nodded, forcing a smile. He understood why they couldn't go. Money was tight, and the fair tickets weren't cheap. Still, it hurt to hear the happy screams and music floating through his window. His mother hugged him extra tight before leaving, promising to bring home a special treat after work. After she left, Darnell tried to keep busy. He cleaned his room, drew some pictures, and watched cartoons on their old TV. But the sounds from the fair kept calling to him. Finally, he couldn't resist anymore. He put on his favorite blue t-shirt and his only pair of sneakers, then carefully locked the apartment door behind him. Just a quick walk, he told himself, just to look. The fairground was only 3 blocks away. As Darnell walked, the sounds grew louder, and the smell of popcorn and sweet treats filled the air. Other kids passed by with their families, holding balloons and stuffed animals they'd won. Some of them he recognized from school, but they were too excited about the fair to notice him. When he reached the fairground fence, Darnell found a spot where he could see through the gaps between the metal bars. The sight took his breath away. Colorful flags waved in the breeze, and the carousel spun in circles, its horses moving up and down to cheerful music. The ice cream vendor's cart was close to the fence, and Darnell watched as lucky children walked away with towering cones of swirled ice cream. His pocket felt heavy with the 2 quarters he found while cleaning his room. It wasn't nearly enough for a ticket, but he held on to them anyway, running his thumb over their ridged edges. A group of kids ran past him, their laughter carried on the summer breeze, and Darnell stepped back from the fence, not wanting to be seen. But he couldn't make himself leave. Instead, he found a grassy spot under a nearby tree where he could watch people coming and going through the fair entrance. From here, he could pretend he was just resting in the shade, not a boy who couldn't afford to join the fun inside. Time passed slowly as Darnell watched families enter and exit the fair. He imagined what it would be like to be on the other side of the fence, the games he would play, the rides he would try, and most of all, the ice cream he would choose. The ice cream stand was so close he could almost taste it. As the morning grew warmer, Darnell's mother's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes life isn't fair, baby, but that doesn't mean it won't get better. He believed her, but right now, watching another kid walk by with a perfect swirled ice cream cone, it was hard to remember that promise. After walking around the fair for an hour, Marcus finally decided it was time. He had been saving the best for last. The ice cream cone he'd been dreaming about for weeks. His mother watched with amusement as he carefully pulled out his Batman wallet, making sure none of his precious dollars would fall out. Are you sure you don't want to try the cotton candy instead? Mrs. Thompson asked, knowing exactly what her son would say. They had passed Mr. Johnson's ice cream stand 3 times already, and each time Marcus had stopped to study the flavors displayed on the colorful board. I'm sure, Mom, Marcus replied, his eyes fixed on the swirled samples Mr. Johnson was showing to other customers. The way the chocolate and vanilla twisted together looked like art, and Marcus could hardly wait to have his own. The line moved slowly, but Marcus didn't mind. He spent the time watching Mr. Johnson work his magic, creating perfect swirls for each customer. Some people ordered plain vanilla, others chose chocolate, but Marcus knew exactly what he wanted, the special swirl that combined both flavors into one amazing treat. When it was finally their turn, Marcus stepped up to the counter, standing as tall as he could. Mr. Johnson smiled down at him, his white handlebar mustache twitching cheerfully. What can I get for you, young man? Marcus took a deep breath, just like he practiced. 1 chocolate and vanilla swirl cone, please. His voice came out clear and confident as he placed 2 crisp dollar bills on the counter. He had saved these specifically for this moment, making sure they weren't wrinkled. Excellent choice, Mr. Johnson said, reaching for a fresh wafer cone. Marcus watched in amazement as the ice cream artist worked his magic. First came the vanilla, smooth and creamy, then the chocolate weaved its way around it, creating perfect spirals. Mr. Johnson moved with the skill of someone who had made thousands of ice cream cones, but still took pride in each one. There you go, son, Mr. Johnson said, handing over the masterpiece. Be careful, it's a warm day, and it'll melt fast. Marcus accepted the cone carefully with both hands, his eyes wide with excitement. The ice cream stood tall and proud, exactly like he had imagined it would. His mother snapped a quick picture with her phone, capturing his moment of pure joy. As they stepped away from the stand, Marcus took his first small lick, wanting to make the treat last as long as possible. The flavors were even better than he had hoped, the vanilla sweet and creamy, the chocolate rich and smooth. He felt like the luckiest kid in the world. That's when he saw him, a boy about his age standing by the fence, trying not to stare but unable to look away. The boy wore a blue t-shirt that had seen better days, and his sneakers were scuffed and worn, but it was his eyes that caught Marcus's attention. They held the same look Marcus remembered seeing in his own reflection last summer when his family couldn't afford to come to the fair. Marcus slowed his steps, the ice cream temporarily forgotten. The boy quickly looked away when he realized he'd been spotted, but not before Marcus saw the longing in his expression. It was a look Marcus understood all too well. The sun beat down strongly now, and a drop of melted ice cream ran down the cone onto Marcus's fingers. He watched as the boy shuffled his feet, kicking at the grass outside the fence. Something stirred in Marcus's heart. A memory of last summer, of pressing his face against that same fence, of watching other kids enjoy treats he couldn't have. His mother must have noticed him stopping because she gently touched his shoulder. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" Marcus looked at his perfect ice cream cone, then back at the boy by the fence. In that moment, he remembered something his grandmother always said. The only thing better than having something special is sharing it with someone else. He made his decision. Time seemed to slow down as Marcus and Darnell's eyes met through the fence. Neither boy spoke at first. They didn't need to. In that quiet moment, something special passed between them, a kind of understanding that only children can share. Darnell tried to look away again, embarrassed at being caught staring. His 2 quarters felt heavy in his pocket, reminding him of how little he had. The ice cream in Marcus's hands looked even better up close, the chocolate and vanilla swirls perfect against the blue summer sky. Marcus took a few steps closer to the fence, still holding his untouched ice cream cone. His mother watched from a short distance, her heart understanding what was happening before either boy said a word. She remembered the kind stranger who had once helped their family when times were tough, and she saw that same kindness now growing in her son's eyes. "Hi," Marcus said softly, stopping near the fence. "I'm Marcus." Darnell looked up, surprised to be spoken to. "I'm Darnell," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "Did you come to see the fair?" Marcus asked, even though he could guess the answer. He noticed how Darnell's shoes were worn at the edges, just like his had been last summer. Darnell nodded slowly. "Just looking," he said, trying to sound like it didn't matter. "I like hearing the music." A drop of ice cream rolled down the cone, and Marcus caught it with his finger before it could fall. The summer heat was making the treat melt faster, but suddenly that didn't seem important anymore. He remembered something his teacher had said during class last week. The best friendships often start with the smallest acts of kindness. "I couldn't come last year," Marcus said, moving even closer to the fence. "We didn't have enough money then. I used to stand here too, just like you're doing." Darnell's eyes widened slightly. He hadn't expected such honesty from a stranger, especially one who now had everything he wished for. "Really?" he asked, his voice stronger now. "Yeah," Marcus nodded. "It was hard watching everyone else have fun, but this year I saved up my own money. I did extra chores and everything." The two boys stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the sounds of the fair washing over them, children laughing on the carousel, the ring toss bells chiming, and the distant music from the speakers. But in their quiet corner by the fence, they had created their own special space. Mrs. Thompson watched her son, tears forming in her eyes as she remembered their own struggles. She saw Darnell's mother's uniform through the fence, the same type she had worn during her own days working at the hospital. Some connections, she knew, were meant to happen. "You know what?" Marcus said, a smile spreading across his face. "Ice cream always tastes better when you share it with a friend." The word friend hung in the air between them, making Darnell stand a little straighter. No one had called him a friend so quickly before, and he felt something warm grow in his chest, pushing away the sadness that had been sitting there all morning. Marcus looked back at his mother, his eyes asking a silent question. She nodded, already walking toward them with the warm smile that always made Marcus feel safe and loved. She understood that sometimes the best memories come from unexpected moments of connection. Through the gaps in the fence, Darnell could see that Marcus's ice cream was starting to melt faster now, but Marcus didn't seem to care. Instead, he was looking at Darnell with the kind of smile that makes everything feel possible, even on the hardest days. In that moment, standing on opposite sides of a metal fence, neither boy knew that this was the beginning of something much bigger than just sharing an ice cream cone. Sometimes the strongest friendships start in the most unlikely places, built on simple acts of understanding and kindness. Want to share? Marcus asked, holding the ice cream cone toward the fence. His voice was steady and sure, like someone who had made up their mind completely. Darnell hesitated, his mother's words echoing in his head. Don't take things from strangers. But Marcus didn't feel like a stranger anymore. There was something about his kind eyes and honest smile that made Darnell want to trust him. Mrs. Thompson noticed another woman standing a short distance from Darnell, a tired-looking lady in hospital scrubs who had been watching the boys carefully. Their eyes met, and Mrs. Thompson gave her a warm, understanding smile. It's okay, the woman called to Darnell, walking closer to the fence. I'm Lisa Williams, Darnell's mother. I was just checking on him during my lunch break. She looked exhausted, but managed a genuine smile. I'm Sarah Thompson, Marcus's mom, Mrs. Thompson replied, moving closer as well. Your son has been keeping mine company. She understood the worry in Lisa's eyes, the same worry any mother would have. While their mothers talked, Marcus looked at the fence separating them from Darnell. It wasn't very tall, and there was a gate just a few feet away. Mom, he said, turning to Mrs. Thompson, can Darnell come in? I saved $2 from my money. That's enough for a ticket, right? Both mothers looked surprised, then touched by Marcus's offer. Mrs. Williams started to shake her head, not wanting to accept charity, but Mrs. Thompson spoke first. What a wonderful idea, Marcus. In fact, she reached into her purse. I think I have an extra ticket from the book we bought. Darnell's eyes lit up, but he looked at his mother questioningly. Mrs. Williams seemed to be having an internal debate, torn between pride and the desire to give her son some happiness. Looking at Marcus's hopeful face and the melting ice cream cone he still held carefully, she made her decision. That's very kind of you, she said softly. Are you sure it's no trouble? No trouble at all, Mrs. Thompson replied, already walking toward the gate. She handed the ticket to the attendant, who smiled and opened it for Darnell. For a moment, Darnell stood frozen, hardly believing this was real. Then, with an encouraging nod from his mother, he walked through the gate. The difference between watching the fair from outside and actually being inside was like stepping into a different world. Marcus didn't wait for things to get awkward. He immediately held out the ice cream cone to Darnell. Here, take the first taste before it all melts. Darnell carefully accepted the cone, handling it like it was made of gold. He took a small lick, and his face broke into a wide smile. The ice cream was even better than he had imagined, creamy and sweet, with a perfect balance of chocolate and vanilla. Good, right? Marcus grinned, watching Darnell's expression. Mr. Johnson makes the best ice cream in town. Darnell nodded enthusiastically and tried to hand the cone back, but Marcus shook his head. Take another lick. We can take turns until it's gone. Their mothers found a nearby bench and sat down together, watching their sons share the ice cream cone. Mrs. Williams had to return to work soon, but for now, she enjoyed seeing her son's happiness. The boys settled into an easy rhythm, one lick for Darnell, one for Marcus, careful not to let any drops fall. They didn't mind that the ice cream was melting faster in the summer heat, or that taking turns meant getting less ice cream each. Somehow, sharing made it taste even better. Around them, the fair continued its cheerful chaos, children shouting on rides, carnival music playing, and games chiming. But in their small corner of the world, two boys had created something special, a moment of pure friendship built on nothing more than a simple gesture and a willingness to share. As Marcus and Darnell continued sharing the ice cream cone, the initial shyness between them melted away just like the sweet treat in their hands. They sat on a green bench near the carousel, taking turns and giggling whenever a drop of ice cream threatened to fall. What grade are you in? Marcus asked, carefully catching a vanilla drip with his finger before it could reach the cone. Second grade at Roosevelt Elementary, Darnell replied, watching as Marcus handled the ice cream with expert care. But next year, I'll be in third. Marcus's eyes lit up. No way. I go to Lincoln Elementary. That's just 3 blocks from Roosevelt. We play against your school in basketball sometimes. You play basketball? Darnell leaned forward eagerly, almost forgetting it was his turn for a lick of ice cream. Me too. Well, mostly in the park near my apartment. My dad taught me before. His voice trailed off, and he looked down at his worn sneakers. Marcus sensed the sadness in his new friend's voice and did what kids do best. He changed the subject. There's a really cool basketball court at my school. Maybe you could come play sometime? I'm not very good yet, but I practice every day after school. Their mothers watched from nearby, their conversation flowing as easily as their sons'. Mrs. Williams had called the hospital to extend her lunch break by 15 minutes, knowing these moments were too precious to rush. Look, Marcus pointed suddenly, making Darnell jump. The ring toss game doesn't have a line right now. Want to try it? I still have $1 left. Darnell reached into his pocket, feeling the 2 quarters he brought. I only have 50 cents, he admitted, his cheeks growing warm. Perfect, Marcus exclaimed. That's enough for both of us to have 2 throws each. We can team up. Before Darnell could protest, Marcus had grabbed his hand and was pulling him toward the game booth. The ice cream cone was almost finished now, just a bit of wafer left, which Marcus insisted Darnell should have. At the ring toss, the booth operator smiled at the boy's enthusiasm. 4 rings for $1.50, he announced, pulling out 4 red plastic rings. Land one on a bottleneck and you win a prize. Marcus let Darnell go first. His new friend's tongue stuck out slightly as he concentrated, aiming carefully at a green bottle in the middle row. The ring flew through the air, bounced off the bottle's neck, and clattered to the ground. So close, Marcus encouraged. Try again. Darnell's second throw came even closer, making both boys hold their breath before the ring slipped off. Then it was Marcus's turn. His first throw went wide, not even touching a bottle. But on his last throw, something magical happened. The red ring sailed through the air in a perfect arc. Time seemed to slow down as both boys watched it descend. With a soft clink, it landed perfectly around the neck of a blue bottle. Winner, the booth operator called out, ringing a small bell. Pick your prize, young man. Marcus looked at the row of stuffed animals, then at Darnell. Without hesitation, he pointed to a small basketball-shaped plush toy. That one, please. When the operator handed it over, Marcus immediately gave it to Darnell. Here, for my new basketball partner. Darnell stared at the gift, his eyes wide. Really? But you won it. That's what friends do, Marcus said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. Besides, now you have to teach me some of your basketball moves. Standing beside each other, clutching the small prize and wearing matching grins, the boys looked like they'd been friends forever instead of just meeting an hour ago. Sometimes the strongest friendships start with the smallest gestures, a shared ice cream cone, a one prize, a simple act of kindness that breaks down all barriers. Tea. The afternoon sun made the fair's colorful flags glow as Marcus and Darnell found a quiet spot near the lemonade stand. Their mothers sat at a nearby table, exchanging phone numbers and sharing stories about their boys. Mrs. Williams had called work again, deciding to take the rest of the day off. Something in her heart told her this day was too important to cut short. Your mom works at the hospital? Marcus asked, watching Darnell carefully hold his plush basketball. That must be really cool. She helps people get better, right? Darnell nodded proudly. Yeah, she works really hard. Sometimes she has to work extra shifts, but she always makes time to play basketball with me on Sundays. He paused, then added quietly, It's been just me and her since Dad left in January. Marcus listened carefully, the way his mother had taught him to when someone was sharing something important. That must be hard, he said softly, remembering how his own dad had moved to another city for work 2 years ago. I only see my dad once a month now. He lives in Chicago. Really? Darnell looked up, surprised to find someone who understood. Do you miss him a lot? Yeah, Marcus admitted, kicking his feet against the bench. But Mom says it's okay to miss people. She says it just means we have a lot of love in our hearts. A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched people walk by. The carousel music played softly in the background, and the sweet smell of cotton candy drifted through the air. You know what's funny? Marcus said suddenly. I was super excited about getting that ice cream cone. I saved my money for weeks, but sharing it with you made it way better than eating it by myself would have been. Darnell smiled, hugging his plush basketball. It was the best ice cream I've ever had, he agreed. Even better than the one Dad bought me last year. We should do this again, Marcus said excitedly. Mom says there's a basketball court at Johnson Park, right between our schools. Maybe we could meet there sometimes? Really? Darnell's eyes lit up. I know that park. There's a really cool playground too, with the big blue slide. As they talked, their mothers watched with knowing smiles. Mrs. Thompson was already writing down her phone number for Mrs. Williams, while Mrs. Williams shared their address and the best times to visit. You could come to my house too, Marcus offered. I have a Nintendo Switch, and we could play basketball in my driveway. Mom painted a target on the garage door for me to practice. I'd never played Nintendo before, Darnell admitted shyly. Then I'll teach you, Marcus declared. And you can teach me those cool basketball moves you were talking about. Deal? Deal. Darnell grinned, holding out his hand like he'd seen grown-ups do when making important agreements. Marcus shook it solemnly, then both boys burst into giggles at how formal they were being. Their laughter carried across the fairground, making other people smile as they passed by. Hey, Marcus, Darnell said after their laughter died down. Thanks for sharing your ice cream with me, and for being my friend. Thanks for being my friend too, Marcus replied. You know what my grandma always says? She says sometimes the best things in life happen when we're willing to share what we have, even if it's just a little bit. As the afternoon sun began to soften, casting long shadows across the fairground, the two boys continued talking. They shared stories about school, their favorite superhero movies, and their dreams of becoming basketball stars. With each passing minute, the fence that had separated them earlier seemed more and more like a distant memory. Their mothers watched their sons bond, both thinking about how sometimes the simplest moments can change lives forever. What had started with a lonely boy watching through a fence and another boy willing to share his ice cream had grown into something beautiful, a friendship that promised to last far beyond this summer day. 3 years had passed since that summer day at the fair, but the memory remained as fresh as ever. Marcus, now 11, and Darnell, 10, stood in line at Mr. Johnson's ice cream stand, just like they did every year on the anniversary of their first meeting. One chocolate and vanilla swirl cone, please, they said together, then burst into laughter. It had become their tradition, sharing one ice cream cone, taking turns just like that first day. Mr. Johnson, his handlebar mustache now more gray than white, smiled as he prepared their special order. He remembered these boys well. Their story had spread through the community, touching hearts and inspiring others to look for opportunities to show kindness. You boys growing taller every year, he said, carefully crafting their swirl. Basketball stars yet? Both boys grinned proudly. They had indeed grown, not just taller, but closer as friends. They played on a youth basketball team together now, practicing every chance they got at the court between their schools. Marcus had improved tremendously thanks to Darnell's coaching, while Darnell had become unbeatable at Nintendo games after countless afternoons at Marcus's house. Their mothers sat at their usual bench nearby, watching their sons with pride. Mrs. Williams no longer had to work extra shifts. She had been promoted to head nurse's aide, thanks partly to Mrs. Thompson's recommendation at the hospital where she now worked in administration. Remember how nervous we were that first day? Mrs. Williams asked, smiling at the memory. Now I can't imagine our lives without your family in it. Mrs. Thompson nodded, watching the boys carefully pass the ice cream cone back and forth. Sometimes the best families are the ones we choose, she replied softly. The story of the two boys sharing ice cream had traveled beyond their neighborhood. Their school principals had heard about it and organized a kindness week inspired by their simple act of sharing. During that week, students were encouraged to look for ways to include others and share what they had. Hey, look. Darnell pointed toward the fence where they first met. A new family stood there, a mother and 2 small children, looking longingly at the fair activities. Marcus and Darnell exchanged glances, then looked at their mothers. No words were needed. Mrs. Thompson was already reaching into her purse for extra tickets, while Mrs. Williams walked toward the family with a warm smile. Would your children like to join us? Mrs. Williams asked the mother, remembering her own hesitation 3 years ago. We have extra tickets, and our boys would love to show them around. The mother's eyes filled with tears of gratitude, while her children's faces lit up with joy. As they walked through the gate, Marcus and Darnell approached with their ice cream cone. "Want to share?" they asked in unison, then laughed at their perfect timing. The small acts of kindness continued to ripple outward. The local newspaper had written a story about their friendship, titled "One Ice Cream Cone, Two Friends, Countless Smiles." People who read it started looking for their own ways to connect with others and share what they had. The basketball court where they practiced became a gathering place for kids from both schools. The fence between their neighborhoods, once a barrier, was now just a meeting point where friends came together to play and share stories. "You know what's crazy?" Marcus said, watching the two new children taste their first Mr. Johnson's ice cream. "All this happened because of one ice cream cone." Darnell shook his head, smiling. "No, it happened because you were willing to share it. That's what made all the difference." As the summer sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the fairground, 4 children now sat sharing stories and ice cream. The tradition that began with 2 lonely boys had grown into something bigger than themselves, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures of kindness can create the biggest changes in the world. And every year, as long as the summer fair came to town, 2 best friends would meet at Mr. Johnson's ice cream stand, order 1 chocolate and vanilla swirl cone, and remember how a simple act of sharing had changed not just their lives, but their entire community.